Today, we're hopping into our time machine and setting the dial to the 18th century, because who doesn't love a good historical serial killer tale? Buckle up, folks, because we're about to meet one of Russia's most notorious lady killers, Darya Saltykova, also known as Saltykova. Our story begins with a typical noblewoman named Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova. Born in 1730, Darya married into the wealthy Saltykov family and soon became a widow at the tender age of 26. You'd think she'd channel her grief into knitting or perhaps gardening, but nope. Our girl Darya took up a hobby much darker: murder. Darya inherited a massive estate, and with it, the power over hundreds of serfs. But instead of being the benevolent lady of the manor, she decided to unleash her inner sadist. Between 1757 and 1764, Saltykova tortured and killed at least 38 of her serfs. Oh, and that's just the number she was convicted for. The real number is suspected to be over 100. Move over, Jack the Ripper. There's a new sheriff in town, and she's got a bone to pick with pretty much everyone. You see, Darya wasn't picky about her methods. She beat her victims with logs, burned them with hot irons, and even poured boiling water over them. And if that wasn't enough, she'd throw them out in the freezing cold just for kicks. Her victims were mostly young women and girls. Only 3 men made the unfortunate cut. She particularly had it out for the young and beautiful, which makes you wonder, was it a case of envy or just pure evil? Now, you'd think after the first dozen or so murders, someone might step in. But no, Darya was well-connected, and complaints to the authorities were often ignored. It wasn't until 2 brave serfs who had lost their loved ones to Darya's cruelty managed to get a petition to Empress Catherine the Great that things started to roll. And boy, did they roll slowly. Let's pause here for a moment to really appreciate the bravery of these serfs. Imagine losing 3 wives to the same sadistic mistress and still mustering the courage to march up to the most powerful woman in Russia. Talk about nerves of steel. Darya was arrested in 1762, but the investigation dragged on for 6 long years. During this time, witnesses were intimidated, and the sheer number of deaths made the whole ordeal a bureaucratic nightmare. Picture this: a court full of powdered wigs and pompous judges slowly sifting through piles of grim evidence. If there's one thing that hasn't changed over the centuries, it's bureaucracy. Finally, in 1768, justice, or something resembling it, was served. Saltykova was publicly shamed, chained on a platform in Moscow with a sign that read, "This woman has tortured and murdered." Quite the walk of shame, wouldn't you say? But here's the kicker. Russia had abolished the death penalty in 1754, so our sadistic noblewoman didn't face the executioner's axe. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison, and not just any prison, mind you, but the basement of a convent, because nothing says penance like being locked in a dark, damp hole beneath a house of God. She spent 33 years there, spitting on curious onlookers and generally being the charming individual she was until her death in 1801. Now let's take a closer look at Saltykova's methods and motivations. It's not every day you come across a serial killer who enjoys such a variety of tortures. Logs, hot irons, boiling water. Saltykova was nothing if not creative. It's almost like she was testing out new methods just to see which one she enjoyed the most. And her favorite targets? Young women and girls. The prettier they were, the more she seemed to hate them. It's like a twisted version of Snow White, but with a lot more blood and fewer dwarfs. Her fury seemed to know no bounds. She'd beat her victims for the smallest infractions. Didn't scrub the floor properly? Here, have a hot iron to the face. Dropped a piece of bread? Time for a boiling water bath. And if you think that's bad, imagine being thrown out into the freezing Russian winter without a stitch of clothing. Or because your noblewoman boss decided she didn't like the look of you that day. But why did she do it? Some say it was out of pure evil, while others suggest she was driven mad by the betrayal of a lover. You see, after her husband died, Darya had a fling with a handsome young man named Nikolai Tyuchev. Things were looking up for her until she found out he was secretly married to a younger woman. Furious, she tried to kill them both, but they managed to escape. From then on, she took out her rage on anyone she saw as a rival, namely the young and beautiful women who worked for her. And speaking of her victims, it wasn't just the women who suffered. Men who worked for Darya had to watch as their wives and daughters were tortured and killed. One man lost 3 wives to Darya's cruelty. Imagine that kind of heartbreak. It's no wonder he finally snapped and took his plea for justice to the Empress herself. Empress Catherine the Great, to her credit, took the accusations seriously. She ordered a full investigation, and the case was blown wide open. Witnesses came forward despite their fear of retaliation. Over the course of 6 years, the authorities pieced together the full extent of Darya's crimes. The final count, at least 38 confirmed murders, though many believe the real number was much higher. But when it came time to punish Darya, Catherine faced a dilemma. The death penalty had been abolished, and executing a noblewoman could spark unrest among the aristocracy. So instead, they decided to go with a public shaming followed by a life sentence. Darya was chained to a platform in Moscow for an hour with a sign around her neck declaring her crimes. It was a sight to see, and you can bet the townsfolk turned out in droves to gawk at the woman who had terrorized so many. After her public humiliation, Darya was carted off to the Ivanovsky convent, where she spent the rest of her days in a dark, windowless cell. For 33 years, she lived in darkness with only a small candle to light her meals. She became increasingly deranged, spitting at visitors and shouting curses at anyone who came too close. Whether her madness was a result of her confinement or if she'd been on the brink all along is anyone's guess. Darya Saltykova died in 1801, ending one of the most gruesome chapters in Russian history. She was buried next to her relatives in the Donskoy monastery necropolis, a final irony for a woman who had caused so much pain and suffering. Her story serves as a grim reminder of the horrors that can unfold when power is left unchecked. So there you have it, folks. Darya Saltykova, a woman who took mean girl to a whole new level. It's a story of power, cruelty, and the slow grind of justice. Remember, if you think your neighbor's a bit too nosy, just be glad they're not setting the bar with a log to your head. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and if you meet a rich widow with a penchant for piety, maybe give her a wide berth. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. See you in the next one.